Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to this special episode of British Culture. Albion Never Dies, the 4th of July, the British Perspective. Why am I doing this podcast? Why am I doing this slightly out of my normal sequence? I've been going every 2 weeks. This is released out of that sequence. Well, partly because it's a very popular topic, especially around this time of year. I follow, Britishness tags on all kinds of websites, on Quora, Reddit, things like that. People frequently ask the question, what is the British perspective on American independence? It's obviously huge if you're in the USA, so it's a natural question to ask, what's the perspective on the other side? And obviously there's endless memes that go around. I'm also recording in West Yorkshire. I live the other side of Leeds from the triumphal arch to the American War of Independence. It's a triumphal arch celebrating victory. That's a really unusual thing, and I'll be talking about why you might have a triumphal arch here in Yorkshire. And the third thing is I really do see the rise, especially in African American studies, to the question of slavery in American independence. That's a minor thing, that's not my strongest suit. But I will acknowledge it. The slave trade ended for the British Empire in 1807. Slavery was abolished in the Empire in 1833. That's compared to the Emancipation Proclamation in the US, 1863, a full 30 years afterwards. And of course, there's become a recent resurgence in studying the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron. So between 1807 and 1860, the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron attacked and seized approximately 1,600 ships involved in the international slave trade and freed around 150,000 Africans. So there are people who question, when America got independence, did that delay freedom for slaves? I have my doubts, to be honest. Obviously there's no counterfactual to history, as Niall Ferguson says in his books, but also if you change one thing, everything else won't necessarily stay the same. There's a bit of butterfly theory going on, but I think it's worth addressing because I see the rise in that question. As I say, every year there's peaks and troughs in this question, and this is the time to talk about it, especially that thing about why would a Brit celebrate the American victory? And I feel for that you need quite a bit of English history. I will give a quick note on terms. I referred to the American War of Independence. Obviously you can say the American Revolutionary War. Both terms are used on both sides of the Atlantic. I'll use whichever comes to mind. Obviously some are more frequent within certain groups of historians and so on. I will use whichever is more frequent. There is an alternative name for it, which is the Second English Civil War. So again, that is something I will be diving into a bit more. That's my little disclaimer on terms. Now into the meat. The meat. What is English history? If it's medieval history, well, I would say a huge amount of it is just contesting the king. I've heard people say when they want to write kind of history on a beer mat, the medieval era, in the old days, the king said do this and everyone just had to do it. But in reality, this was not true. There's limits to ability to make your wishes known. If you're in London and you want something to be done in Yorkshire, it's just not always practical to get it done. I mean, for one thing, even now, if I want to get down to London, the train is, about 3 hours down to London, but that's, from a key hub to a key hub on a pretty fast train. In reality, if I'm going door to door from my front door to, say, a friend's in London, it's probably going to be 5 hours, and that's with modern infrastructure. It was obviously a lot more difficult when roads were not reliable, before we had trains, when it's horse and carts and so on. Even getting messages across, and, obviously pigeons, you can actually get really fast communication between London and Yorkshire back then. However, it's slower than the modern day, and you're always playing a certain element of the game that's known in America as telephone. We call it Chinese whispers in the UK. So even if everybody is willing to make the king's wishes known all throughout the land, there are practical challenges, and much of English medieval history is barons trying to limit the power of the king. This was often a question I had as a child, actually. As I went around the UK, I saw castles all over the place, and I thought, well, it's not to protect us from the French. We're quite a long way from here. If you're in Wales, a lot of those castles were built by the English to subjugate Wales. But in England, who was the enemy? And initially, when William the Conqueror came to England, they were built to secure his power base. But pretty quickly, the people he gave the castles to realised it gave them a power base. If you want a really good kind of overview of all that, I feel especially if you're not from the UK, then I would suggest the book Unruly, The Ridiculous History of England's Kings and Queens by David Mitchell. It's a really, really good overview, even if you're English. I've listened to the audiobook. I really enjoyed it, especially because it's read by the author. He did history at the University of Cambridge, although he got a gentleman's degree too, perhaps due to his interest in footlights, the dramatic society there. He's best known as a very quick-witted comedy panellist, but he is a very good writer and does have an interesting take on history. As I say, if you want a big narrative, it's a really good narrative of our medieval history. Also goes back much further than just the Norman conquest, which I like. I'm recording this in the West Yorkshire town of Bingley, close to Leeds. Bingley got its market charter in the year 1212, and the market charter was granted by the king with the most famous limitation on his power. That king is called Bad King John, very frequently just called Bad King John, and of course in the 1973 Disney version of Robin Hood, he's the sorry-looking lion who's always sucking his thumb and losing his temper. In real history, his power was limited by the Magna Carta, and yes, King John in real life is the brother of good King Richard. King John ruled whilst his brother was on crusade, but then ruled after his death as well. And I realised for movie references I could go with 1968's The Lion in Winter, which of course has Timothy Dalton as Philip II of France, but I'm keeping it fun. And also, if you want a more modern film, there's obviously 2010's Robin Hood, starring Russell Crowe, and features two-time Bond girl Léa Seydoux. That's a really good look at medieval Britain. I really enjoy the director's cut and the cinema cut. Anyway, the Magna Carta. What is it? Well, it's a charter. There's two copies at the British Library. There's one in Lincoln Castle and one in Salisbury Cathedral. My wife's seen it in real life. She is American, by the way. I actually haven't seen it. What it essentially is a limitation on King John's personal power. He was a bad king due to his favouritism, unpredictability and overall ineptitude. We've had more brutal kings, we've had cruel kings, but that favouritism meant that if you worked really hard, you wouldn't be recognised. His unpredictability meant you never knew what was going to happen next. The ineptitude, well, that has an obvious flaw. So he was one of our least rated kings overall in his lifetime and ever since. After John's death, there was a regency government of his young son Henry III, and this document got reissued. That's unusual, because often there were charters between medieval kings and their barons, but this survived a king. It went to his son, reissued in 1216, in an ultimately unsuccessful attempt to secure his political base. At the end of a barons' conflict in 1217, again it was part of a peace treaty, where it got the name Magna Carta to differentiate it from another charter written around the same time. And then when he was short of funds, Henry reissued the charter again in 1225 in exchange for a grant of new taxes. So we had increased representation, not of the people, of the barons, but in exchange for taxation, which starts to give us a key part of British history. His son, Edward I, reissued the Magna Carta in 1297, and that really confirms it as part of England's statute law. That's why it's part of our constitution, which is a collection of documents. It's not one single written document. Some people will say England has no constitution. It has no single written document, but it's a huge collection of them. Magna Carta kind of forms part of it, according to most of our constitutional lawyers. But the interesting thing is, three kings really confirmed the importance of this. I've recommended a really light book, Unruly by David Mitchell, a light movie, the Disney version of Robin Hood, which does kind of tie into this. Obviously the Russell Crowe Robin Hood actually goes more into northern rebellions, and these are very much northern rebellions. The perfect deep medieval dive, and I think I've talked about this book before, is A Great and Terrible King, Edward I and the Forging of Modern Britain by Marc Morris. I think it's a 2010 book, but it remains my favourite book on British medieval history. A very straight biography of one of our most successful kings. So we have one of our least successful kings, King John, who confirms the Magna Carta, and one of our most successful medieval kings, who also confirms it. Sticking with my local interest, I live near Bradford, and Bradford City Hall, as you walk around it, there's a statue of every king or reigning queen of England, and it's carved into the building, so they're part of it. So you can walk around. I always look out for John and Edward, always find it startling how close together. Note I don't say John the First, because obviously if the first king of a name is unsuccessful, people don't get named after him. A possible exception is Charles I, who named his son after himself before his greatest failure, which was being executed. So we do have a Charles I, second, and obviously now we have a third. Interestingly, as I walk around Bradford City Hall, aside from all the kings and queens, there's also a statue of Oliver Cromwell, a particular hero of George Washington. Just checking in on that American history quickly. It's a powerful statement for the city, because, I mean, he has, I guess, every much a right to be counted as a ruler as any royal. He is a controversial figure. He ruled in England after King Charles I was beheaded for treason on 30th of January 1649. Cromwell received the title Lord Protector, and he acted as essentially dictator, 16th of December 1653 to 3rd of September 1658. I did a podcast focus on Cromwell a few years ago. O is for Oliver Cromwell. That really delves into the controversies of him. So if you'd like more information on him, do check out that podcast. And for those who like, again, greater depth, Antonia Fraser's book on him remains the best. And for those who just want a really quick overview, the semi-accurate 1970 movie is a fun way to get a rough idea of the broad strokes. They take liberties, but overall, it's pretty good. Again, this war, the Civil War, was no taxation without representation. That's become the issue for which it's rarely remembered for. Most people would say it was fought between, say, 1642 to 1651. Bradford was on the parliamentary side, Parliament versus the King. Those who are a bit more into the nitty-gritty detail will say at least there's 3 English civil wars, 1642 to 1646, and then 1648 in itself, and then 1649 to 1651, so 3 major phases of that conflict. But the period of conflict in Britain actually began earlier in Scotland with the Bishops' Wars of 1639 to 40, and in Ireland with the Ulster Rebellion of 1641. So it does stretch out, and the conflicts do interrelate. The causes also included religion and political philosophy, so it marks a real significant change from kind of barons' wars and crusades of the medieval era. Individuals also mattered more than in previous conflicts. Not to understate the importance of lords and landowners, it's all relative, but Bradford was, as I say, parliamentary, and the cathedral shield of heraldry has woolsacks on it, which may seem in a lot of places that would be because of the wealth that wool trading gave to the city, but in fact woolsacks were used to protect the tower of the cathedral during the English Civil War. Again, as I said, I did this deep dive on Cromwell, and that goes deep into the Civil War, so I won't repeat the whole thing here. I will summarise, and I'll say that does compromise on a lot of important nuance, but for the sake of time I will. Cromwell, of course, supported Parliament, and like many who did so, had very strong religious fervour. His views on Catholics in Ireland may have been shaped by this, but the most brutal massacre his commanders committed there was actually against a force commanded by Englishmen. So it was a slaughter of led by Englishmen against those led by Englishmen, but they were royalists and parliamentaries. Royalists were generally more tolerant of Catholics, and that was something anathema to Cromwell. So again, religion was the primary identity for a lot of people in this, rather than nationality or even loyalty to Parliament or King. So both sides had that. Cromwell's brand, as I say, was more puritanical version of Christianity than the King. The King leaned towards great tolerance of Catholicism. So that's one of the big shapers of British history. Of course, given the UK is a monarchy today, that would seem to give spoilers for the Civil War film Cromwell. And a statue of Charles I faces Parliament from Trafalgar Square. But on the grounds of Parliament itself, there's a statue of Cromwell, which faces a very small statue of Charles I on the other side of the road. The two enemies face each other forever. The real monuments, obviously the statues, but the real monuments to them both come in the form of the institutions they left behind. The monarch as the head of state, and Parliament, which retains the power to raise and spend taxes. Of course, Parliament passes laws, but these laws require royal assent. Parliament oversees services, but the civil service works for the monarch. And it's just a strong indication, after a civil war, you need to live side by side as neighbours with your previous enemy. So, now I'm starting to move towards American independence, where it gets good for a lot of people, I realise. So George Mason, founding father, is widely quoted as saying, "We claim nothing but the liberty and privileges of Englishmen in the same degree as if we had continued among our brethren in Great Britain." So what is he referring to, the liberty and privileges of Englishmen? Well, primarily the Magna Carta, or what was now generally understood to be the meaning of it. It was, of course, written to protect barons for the king, but they phrased it as free men, and now that applied to so many people that it was generally considered to apply to a vast number of people. Of course, they're also referring to the Petition of Right in 1628, again kind of leading up to our Civil War time, and the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679, the Bill of Rights 1689. So again, it's all part of the same milieu. So George Mason, founding father, is referring to all of this history, and it includes no taxation without representation, a key factor in the English Civil War. An interesting kind of similarity as well is that the colonies were protected by the Royal Navy, which was being funded largely from mainland Britain. The outrage for the colonists is they were being asked to pay for their own protection, but this is almost identical to the English in England during the English Civil War. Charles I wanted to raise taxes to pay for the Royal Navy. The English people were not happy. John Chester Miller, in his 1959 Origins of the American Revolution, a great book from Stanford University Press, he said, quote, "As long as the rights of Englishmen remain the goal, most Americans warmly supported the Patriot leaders. When the rights of Americans in independence Great Britain were put forward, the colonists began to divide into hostile camps." End quote. Again, I find this fascinating because it's not so different from the English Civil War, which moved forward in those stages. The reason I refer to, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 of our Civil War and the other conflicts going on is that initially the real leaders of the English Civil War, which was not Cromwell, the film obviously focuses on him, it's a biopic, but it was not Cromwell at the beginning. He was considered an extremist, was a bit of an outsider. People said that they were fighting and were loyal to the king on the parliamentary side. We know now, in the 21st century, how it all ended. We know they executed the king. But they had no idea at the outset that this was the road that they were on, and if some were aware, they were seen as, I say, extremists, a fringe minority. Wars were fought for causes, but it's not unusual for the wars to change and evolve the causes themselves, and I would suggest it was the case in both.
From digital security to social cohesion, the Resilience podcast series brings expert insights on strengthening civil society in challenging times. Listen to the latest episodes and join the conversation.
I feel the reference to taxation all throughout does beg the question, does it all come down just to money? Money was a key factor in the rebellion against King John. Money and religion had fueled the Civil War. But for the Americans, it almost seems like a return to English core values, money and representation. Simon Sharma's A History of Britain is a seminal BBC documentary, year 2000 to 2002, subsequent trilogy of books that are really good. He kind of makes the argument, to simplify, that the Americans were just becoming more English than the English. He felt that the English were straying away from their Englishness, whilst the Americans in the colonies were, maintaining their Englishness. I often see jokes again around this time of year, that Americans just hate tea. And I often have that throwing tea in the harbour is sometimes seen as almost a rejection of tea. But in reality, it's so much more interesting than that, right? They were objecting to the taxation of tea. They were objecting that tea was so expensive. How English is that, to go on a riot because your tea is too expensive? The later cultural change to coffee kind of represents a change of focus to hard power in Latin America. And again, it becomes hard for a British person to criticise an essentially imperialist project, influenced daily habits of an imperial power. After all, our tea habit is shaped by Britain's imperial adventures in southern China and India, and so on and so on, referenced in the deep dive into tea episode. I would also add, although it's not entirely comparable, I'll just quickly add this. When people riot today, we see it on the news, they smash shops selling expensive trainers and electronics. I don't think they have an issue with expensive trainers and electronics. Equally, they often leave bookshops alone. I don't think that's because they absolutely love books. So in a similar way, colonists, revolutionaries lashing out against tea, I don't think that demonstrates they hate tea. In fact, I think they really, really liked tea. Anyway, that's the end of that comparison. To go more into contemporary issues, religion did play a part in the Revolutionary War. Protestant Irish were strongly, strongly represented among the settlers, whilst Catholic Irish formed the largest volunteer contingent to quell the rebellion. So the Catholic Irish supported the king, as they did in the English Civil War. The Protestant Irish were largely against, again, as in the English Civil War. So, as a result, parliamentary English, many Protestant English, which is the majority, actually sympathised with the colonials, and again the north of England, which had rebelled against the southern king so many times. That's why you start to get the triumphal arch in Yorkshire. Now, until now, I've just really spoken about the English, the UK, the British Isles, the colonies, and so on, but it may be worth broadening out our Anglo-centric world view. So for the English, if I say the word empire, empire means India and basically all the others. America was at the time just a settlement, one to forestall moves by the French and the Dutch in the north, and perhaps stop expansion by the Spanish and the Portuguese, although I feel that horse had bolted. Anyway, as it turned out, the independent USA would fulfill the exact same role, whether we paid for their defence or not. In fact, a liberated USA would go much, much further than the English had ever really imagined with ideas of manifest destiny. The British would focus efforts on India, driving out the French and gaining the revenue from what was proving, for at least the first 100 years after US independence, a much, much more profitable venture. There was, of course, not necessarily friendship straight away. We share the same language, we demand the same rights, we have largely the same desires. The US might have an alliance with the French, but didn't particularly want the French political model. And Britain and America, I say, they aligned remarkably quickly. There was the War of 1812. The US attempted to invade Canada, but were driven back. The White House burned. I mention this mainly because it's important to my listeners in Canada. However, I have to say, from a London perspective, Squabbles in the New World of 1812 is not only a footnote to history of the 19th century, or a footnote to the early 19th century, it's actually a footnote for us for what happened in 1812, which is, of course, Napoleon's disastrous campaign against the Russians. That's closer to home, and it's part of our run-up to the Battle of Waterloo, which is much more exciting for most of us studying English history. But also, 1812, 5:15 p.m, on the 11th of May, 1812, Spencer Perceval, the Prime Minister, was assassinated. He is the only Prime Minister in our history to be assassinated. It was at the time of the Napoleonic War, and was nothing to do with the Napoleonic War. He was assassinated by an aggrieved merchant, somebody who just had an issue with the government. So I'd say here in the UK it's a relatively little-known fact that we even had a Prime Minister who was assassinated, and pretty unusual to be able to name Spencer Perceval. But that's one of the key issues in 1812. Apart from that, well, as I say, the Declaration of Independence is curious. It's often stated to be the assertion of a new identity, but like many who rebel, almost like the rebellious member of a family, it oddly resembles those they are rebelling against. The US has a Georgian English-inspired constitution. The president was initially envisaged as pretty much like King George, or King George the First and Second, a bit like the Third maybe, in that he's the commander-in-chief. He's responsible mainly for foreign policy, whilst balancing the interests of powerful magnates at home, modified through a democratic process, all of this whilst living in what is essentially a Georgian palace. The checks and balances of the US Constitution, even today, with all the amendments, strongly resemble those in England at that time. So the US political model is strangely similar to Georgian England. If I read about US scandals, that's not really part of my news cycle, but it's often to do with US political lobbying, and again the political lobbying in Georgian England and references to rotten boroughs and so on. I'll leave the exact comparisons to those who are just more invested in it, but it's not worlds apart. The UK, on the other hand, has reformed almost every state matter in the reign of Queen Victoria. So it's the UK which changed more, and if you want a specific example, military drill is actually one of them. So if you want to see the British Army drill of the 1700s, get some modern-day US troops. George Washington, having gained his training from the British and critically admiring Cromwell, set the US Army's parade drill to be exact. So the British drill was thoroughly changed, at least in the Victorian era, and then continuing on. So minor details like rifles don't get spun round in our British drill. Obviously they do in US military drill. That's because that's what George Washington did. It doesn't make sense for a modern rifle, but they're paying homage to the army of George Washington, whilst we have no reason to do that. So, again, worth mentioning, minor issue, this wasn't actually the end. I'm talking about the long run-up from King John until the American War of Independence, but that wasn't actually the end of uprising in the colonies. So shortly afterwards, veterans of the Revolutionary War would engage in an uprising and cause a number of headaches for the Founding Fathers. Again, that has echoes of Cromwell's troops. His former parliamentary troops caused huge issues in 17th century England. And of course, we have the Civil War. I feel I've made the case for why we have such comparisons between the English Civil War and the American Revolutionary War. So this is why we get this idea that the US Revolutionary War could be considered a second English Civil War. I refer to the Civil War in the United States because, again, there's that question I referenced at the beginning: would slavery have ended sooner if the colonies had stayed with England? Perhaps. However, the British Empire would have struggled to emancipate the slaves as early as 1807 for the trade and 1833 for the existence, and I know this because I have actually paid taxes for the ending of slavery, because the British government only paid off our debts in this regard in 2015, our financial debts. This is because when we ended slavery in the British Empire, 40% of the national budget was paid to slave owners in the British colonies to compensate them for their loss. We bought their freedom. And of course the West African Squadron would become the longest lasting Royal Navy operation in history to enforce the anti-slave trade law, including combating countries of other countries still practicing the trade. So that is my recommended rabbit hole. But given the financial outlay in 1833, given that huge financial outlay that we could only pay off finally our debts in 2015, I suspect it would have been quite a bit more expensive had we tried to do it with American colonies which practiced slavery. Finally, the British perspective. Having said all that, what is the British view of US independence? And unfortunately, it's a slightly boring answer. It's rather a shrug. It's a bit like the English love to beat the Germans at football, whereas in my experience the Germans really don't care about playing against the English. The Germans' absolute passion is Germany beating the Dutch at football. Very few, colonies used to be British. I mean, 13 out of currently 50 states. But then the whole of India was, of course, British. So was, Pakistan, Bangladesh, large parts of Africa, much of the world. And yet most Brits are better off today than we were back then. We live much more comfortably in the 21st century than we did, at the height of imperial power in the 19th century. So what we can say also is that the Second English Civil War, if we call it that, ended with the two sides having an ocean between them, right? Whereas the other side from the first Civil War, Cromwell's Civil War, they're still our friends, our neighbours. I've lived in areas that are proud, absolutely proud, as Bradford is, of their parliamentary support, whilst I've lived in areas that are absolutely proud of their royalist support. That carries on, and I think the tension that's kind of built into our constitution kind of supports this, our unwritten, slightly written constitution. So we live still with our neighbours, our former enemies from the English Civil War. We don't live day to day with Americans down our street. We've got a great big ocean between us. That changes things. Don't get me started on the wars between the House of York and the House of Lancashire, another medieval conflict. We only have the Pennine Hills between us, but neither side thinks that's enough of a barrier. I think they'd be quite happy to have the Atlantic Ocean between them. So the British view of US independence is not very much, but it is jolly interesting. I found it interesting, and I hope you found that take interesting. There's a number of books that I've referenced throughout, and of course I do have them named in the show notes, so you can find them easily. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Thomas, and there'll be another episode next week. Happy 4th of July. Bye.